The turn of a new year gives us an opportunity for a reset, to examine our lives, consider some changes we want to make, and declare our resolutions to pursue those things. The problem is, too many of us are impatient and we give up too quickly. We're unwilling to make the necessary adjustments to get the results we're looking for, or, plain and simple, when things start getting difficult, we just don't have the strength to persevere. In this episode of Practically Biblical, I'll share a story about a man named Nehemiah whose passionate resolve allowed him to overcome all sorts of obstacles and took him from enjoying the pleasures of a Persian palace to rebuilding the walls of a city in ruins. More on that right after this. Welcome back to the channel. My name's Brian and this is Practically Biblical. This channel is all about sharing stories of scripture and offering practical insights that I hope encourage you to explore the Bible more for yourself. So if you've ever found the Bible confusing or hard to understand, consider subscribing to this channel for fresh content every week that's going to help you grow in your knowledge and understanding of scripture. And if you find value in this video, if you learned something new, let me know by hitting that like button. Consider subscribing to the channel. Our numbers are growing and it's been fun. We're just launching into 2021 today. This is our first video of the new year, so let's get into it. The book of Nehemiah tells the story of the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem in the mid-400s BC and the man who led the operation. His name was, well, Nehemiah, and he was a Jewish exile who grew up in a foreign land far from the home of his ancestors. He was raised hearing stories of his homeland and developed a longing to get there to see it. You see, about 140 years before Nehemiah stepped on the scene, the Babylonian Empire conquered Judah, and in the process destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem. The Jews were taken captive and exiled to Babylon. Eventually, the Persian Empire rose to power and overtook the Babylonians and began allowing the exiles to return to their homeland. Nehemiah was born and raised under the rule of the Persians, and by the time his story picked up in the scriptures, he was serving in the Citadel of Susa as the trusted cupbearer of King Artaxerxes of Persia. It was a position that afforded him the comforts of the palace and the protection of the king. Despite all the privilege he enjoyed, Nehemiah sensed a greater purpose for his life that aligned with his passion to see the great city of Jerusalem that he had heard so much about. Some of the exiles who had traveled to Jerusalem made their way back to their families still living throughout the Persian Empire to bring news of their homeland. Nehemiah was heartbroken when his brother Hanani brought news that the walls of the city still lay in ruins. But rather than crushing his spirit, this news stirred a passion and developed into a full-blown vision to rebuild the city walls and restore the city to its former glory. Nehemiah recognized that there would be obstacles in his way, the biggest of which might be the first: relieving himself from the king's service. So he turned to the Lord in prayer and fasting, seeking favor from Artaxerxes and permission to depart from the palace to rebuild Jerusalem. And after some time had passed, which we'll talk about in just a minute, Nehemiah courageously shared with the king what was on his heart and asked to be dismissed long enough to rebuild the wall. And as you read the story, you quickly realize that this wasn't just a passing thought about how cool it would be to rebuild the walls. This man did his research, and he had a plan to execute it with the king's permission. He knew the resources he needed, the places he could get them, and the people who needed to know about it. After hearing him out, King Artaxerxes not only granted him permission to go, he also gave him everything he asked for to set him up for success. But there was trouble ahead for Nehemiah, which we'll talk about in my next video. I'll link that right here once it's done. But before you jump ahead to that video, let's talk about the key points of this story. Nehemiah had an unshakable passion, which honestly didn't make much sense. He was heartbroken for a city he had never been to, and he didn't know if it would ever be a reality. But he also lived in tension. He lived in tension for months, but he used the time to prepare. When we hear these stories or read them on our own, it's easy to miss some of those key details. So when we read that Nehemiah prayed to the Lord for the king's favor, followed by Artaxerxes granting his request, we miss the fact that this was a 4-month process that Nehemiah underwent. And the whole time he was wrestling with this call. He spent months fasting and praying for direction, wisdom, and the favor of the king. And when the time finally came, it was actually the king himself who asked what was troubling Nehemiah. Even then, Nehemiah was afraid to share. But the journey of the months before gave him the courage to speak. And that brings us to the third key point of this story. When the opportunity presented itself, he courageously took the first step. He not only asked to leave, but for all the resources he would need to make it happen. And that was a bold move that certainly was not on his mind 4 months before when this passion was ignited. So let me ask you, what are you passionate about? What keeps you up at night? What dreams do you have that you just can't shake? What would it look like for you to start pursuing those things? To live maybe for a time, even in the tension of having a dream, but not yet knowing how to make it happen. What are you doing now to prepare to jump when the opportunity presents itself? It may not happen overnight. In fact, it may be months, years, or even decades in the making, but the journey will be worth it. And when the time comes, you'll be ready. So be courageous and go for it. What's a passion, a hobby, or a goal that you plan to pursue this year? Let me know in the comments because that could be your first step toward making it a reality. That'll do it for this episode of Practically Biblical. But before you go, let me remind you that in the next video, we'll see how Nehemiah went about rebuilding those walls and how long it took him to do so. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to be notified when new content is released. And if you're so inclined to want to help this channel grow to the next 100 subscribers, just click that little share button, send the link to a friend, or post it on your social media. 2021 is going to be a great year, and I look forward to continuing the journey with you right here on Practically Biblical.